The sky over Germany belonged to death that winter morning. A single American fighter pilot saw something that made his blood run cold. 30 heavy bombers drifting alone through hostile airspace, and below them, more than a dozen enemy aircraft circling like wolves around wounded prey. He checked his fuel gauge, calculated the odds, and made a decision that would change air combat forever. What happened in the next half hour defied every tactical manual ever written, and the enemy pilots who survived it would file reports that their commanders initially refused to believe. The frozen months of 1943 had turned the air war over Europe into a mathematics of death. American bomber crews climbed into their aircraft knowing the statistics, and the statistics were merciless. Flying in broad daylight across occupied territory, these massive formations of B-17 flying fortresses represented the Allied belief that precision bombing could cripple German industry and bring the war to an end. The theory was beautiful in its simplicity. Hundreds of bombers flying in tight formation, their combined defensive firepower creating an impenetrable shield, would strike military and industrial targets with unprecedented accuracy and return home safely. Reality painted a different picture entirely, one written in burning aluminum and falling men. The German fighter force had developed a methodology that was as effective as it was terrifying. Pilots flying Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s discovered that attacking from the front gave them a massive advantage. The bombers carried guns in every direction except the one that mattered most. Their nose turrets held machine guns, but the gunners faced an impossible task, tracking targets approaching at combined speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, with only seconds to aim and fire before the enemy flashed past or through their formation. Most crews never got a shot off. The Germans knew this weakness and exploited it ruthlessly, climbing high above the bomber streams, positioning themselves ahead of the formations, then rolling into steep dives that brought them screaming toward the bombers head-on. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine sitting in the nose of a bomber, watching enemy fighters grow larger in your windscreen, knowing they're firing cannons and machine guns directly at you, knowing your own weapons are inadequate to stop them, knowing that in seconds they'll either destroy you or flash past so close you can see the pilot's face. Some men broke under that pressure. Others endured it mission after mission, their nerves worn to threads, counting down the required number of sorties before they could go home, assuming they lived that long. By December of that year, certain missions saw casualty rates climb above 20%. Entire squadrons simply vanished over industrial targets in the Ruhr Valley or rail yards deep in Germany. American commanders tried everything. They experimented with formation patterns, staggered altitudes, and fighter escorts whenever possible. But the escort fighters of late 1943 lacked the range to penetrate deep into German territory. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings could barely reach the border before fuel constraints forced them to turn back, leaving the bombers to continue alone into the most heavily defended airspace in the world. The Luftwaffe waited for exactly these moments, when the bombers were most vulnerable, most isolated, and most desperate. The sensory experience of these missions existed beyond normal human comprehension. 9 Wright Cyclone engines on each bomber produced a roar that penetrated bone. Gun turrets rattled and swiveled constantly as gunners searched for threats. Radio channels crackled with terse position reports and warnings. Then came the sounds that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. The banshee shriek of diving enemy fighters, the hammering percussion of 20mm cannon shells tearing through thin aluminum skin, the awful wet sound when rounds found human bodies instead of metal, and sometimes the most terrible sound of all, the silence when engines stopped and a 60,000-pound aircraft began its terminal plunge toward Earth. This was the world that First Lieutenant James Howard inhabited on his 23rd combat mission. His path to that frozen German sky had been anything but conventional. Born in Canton, China in 1913 to American missionary parents, he grew up in an environment that taught him to think creatively with limited resources. His father operated a medical mission while his mother taught at a local school, and young Howard absorbed lessons about problem-solving and adaptability that no military academy could have provided. He eventually returned to America for university, studying pre-medicine at Pomona College, but aviation called to him more strongly than anatomy. In 1937, Howard left school to pursue flying, joining the Navy's Aviation Cadet Program. A minor medical issue that should have been inconsequential ended his naval career before it began. Most men would have accepted this defeat and moved on. Howard went to China instead. When the American volunteer group formed in 1941 under Claire Chennault's command, Howard was there, flying Curtiss P-40 Warhawks against Japanese aircraft over Burma and southern China. The Flying Tigers operated under impossible conditions, no spare parts, no reinforcements, perpetually outnumbered and outgunned. They learned to fight smart because fighting fair meant dying. Howard excelled in this environment. He studied the P-40's characteristics and found ways to maximize its strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. The aircraft could dive fast and absorb tremendous punishment. Howard learned to use altitude and sun position to set up attacks, to bait enemy pilots into disadvantageous situations, and to strike when victory was most certain. In 6 months of combat, he destroyed 6 enemy aircraft and established himself as one of the unit's most reliable pilots. When the Flying Tigers disbanded in mid-1942, Howard returned to the United States and received a commission in the Army Air Forces. He expected assignment to the Pacific Theater. Instead, the Air Force sent him to England, where he joined the 354th Fighter Squadron of the 355th Fighter Group. They flew P-51 Mustangs, sleek long-range fighters that would eventually become legendary as bomber escorts. But in late 1943, Mustang units were still relatively small and the bomber offensive was reaching its bloodiest phase. At 30 years old, Howard was significantly older than most fighter pilots. He didn't drink heavily or engage in the typical fighter jock bravado. Instead, he studied mission reports, asked detailed questions about enemy tactics, and thought systematically about how air combat actually worked. His squadron mates respected his competence but found him difficult to read. He flew with a calculated fearlessness that seemed more like chess than combat. On January 11, 1944, Howard received his assignment: escort bombers attacking industrial facilities near Ostravsleben, deep inside Germany. The mission pushed the absolute limits of fighter range. The escorts would have barely enough fuel to reach the bombers, provide protection for a critical window, and race back to England before their tanks ran dry. Howard took off in the pre-dawn darkness, formed up with his flight, and climbed toward the bomber stream. He had no way of knowing that within an hour he would face a situation no tactical doctrine had ever addressed. The mission began falling apart well before reaching the target area. Dense cloud cover over the North Sea reduced visibility to near zero. Radio discipline collapsed as flights struggled to maintain visual contact with each other. The bomber stream stretched out and lost its defensive cohesion, becoming vulnerable to precisely the kind of coordinated attack the Germans specialized in. Then enemy fighters appeared, climbing out of the haze in groups of 4 and 6, positioning themselves ahead of the bombers for their signature head-on assault. The outnumbered P-51 escorts engaged immediately. Individual dogfights erupted across miles of sky as pilots broke formation to chase attackers or defend bombers already under fire. Within minutes, the careful geometry of the escort mission dissolved into chaos. Howard's flight got pulled into a running battle with a group of Focke-Wulf 190s. He fired at targets, maneuvered defensively, and tried desperately to stay between the enemy and the bombers, but the mathematics were brutal. Too many German fighters, too few American escorts, and fuel burning away with every second of combat. Then Howard looked up and saw disaster taking shape. A formation of approximately 30 B-17s had become separated from the main bomber stream and was drifting westward, completely alone. Below them, at least 12 German fighters were climbing in a lazy spiral, setting up for a coordinated attack that would tear the formation to pieces. Howard checked his fuel gauge and his tactical situation. He tried raising his flight on the radio but got only static. He scanned the sky for other P-51s. There were none. The bombers had perhaps 5 minutes before the Germans struck. If Howard turned back toward England, he might make it home with his remaining fuel. If he engaged alone, he would face 10-to-1 odds at minimum. And even if he survived the initial passes, the enemy would swarm him the moment they realized he was the only defender. No training scenario covered this situation. No tactical manual offered guidance. The choice was brutally simple: abandon those bomber crews to certain destruction, or fight. Howard shoved his throttle to maximum power and dove toward the bombers. The German fighters hadn't yet committed to their attack runs. They were still communicating and positioning, which gave Howard one critical advantage: surprise. They weren't expecting a single Mustang to challenge an entire staffel. He closed the distance rapidly, bringing the bombers large into his windscreen. He could see their ball turrets rotating, waist gunners tracking movement, the formation instinctively tightening as they detected the threat below. The first German flight peeled off and dove toward the bombers. Howard rolled hard, pulled lead, and opened fire. His tracers cut through the air and struck the wing of a Messerschmitt. The damaged fighter broke off trailing smoke, and the others scattered. Confusion rippled through the German formation. One escort shouldn't have posed any real threat, but Howard wasn't flying like a conventional escort. He was flying like a man who had calculated the geometry perfectly and understood exactly what needed to happen. The Luftwaffe reorganized and came again. They tried multiple approaches, head-on passes, beam attacks from the side, slashing dives from high altitude. Howard met each attack with fire and aggressive maneuvering. He didn't try to dogfight or chase individual enemies. He stayed close to the bombers and made himself the problem that every German pilot had to solve before they could reach their primary targets. Then Howard did something that shattered every rule of fighter escort doctrine. He flew directly into the middle of the bomber formation. Fighter tactics in 1943 were absolutely clear on this point. Escorts operated outside the bomber formation. They patrolled the flanks, maintained high cover, and intercepted threats along the approach vectors. Close escort was considered defensive, passive, and ineffective. No one flew inside the formation itself. The risks were too severe. Bombers flew wingtip to wingtip in tight formation with minimal margin for error. Turbulence from propellers and slipstreams created invisible barriers of disturbed air that could cause a fighter to lose control. And bomber gunners were trained to shoot at anything that moved within range, friend or foe. But Howard understood something the doctrine writers missed. The German head-on attack depended fundamentally on a clear approach path. The attacking fighters needed a straight line, high speed, and unobstructed field of fire. If a defending fighter positioned itself directly between the Germans and their targets, the attackers faced an impossible choice: break off the attack or risk a head-on collision with an armed opponent at combined closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. Howard eased his Mustang into the lead element of the bomber formation. He throttled back to match their airspeed and flew just ahead of the lead B-17, low and centered, his fighter silhouetted against the sky. The bomber crews spotted him immediately but didn't understand what they were seeing. Some thought he was lost. Others assumed he'd been damaged and was trying to stay close for emergency assistance. A few gunners tracked him reflexively, fingers near triggers, waiting to determine if he was friend or threat. The Germans came again. 2 Messerschmitts diving from 11 o'clock high, nose on, cannons charged. They had a perfect attack angle. The bombers were locked in formation, unable to evade. The geometry was textbook, but Howard was there. He held position until the last possible moment, then fired a short burst and broke left. The lead German fighter flinched, rolled away, and pulled out of the dive. The second fighter followed. Either pressed their attack. The risk was too high. The Mustang blocked their approach, and it was shooting back. Howard climbed, rolled, and returned to the formation. He tucked himself back into the lead element, just ahead and slightly below the bombers. The pilots understood now. He wasn't lost or damaged. He was a shield. The Germans regrouped and tried different approaches. They attempted beam attacks from the side. Howard met them aggressively. They tried vertical dives from directly above. He climbed and forced them to overshoot. They tried coordinated runs from multiple angles simultaneously. He pivoted, fired, and disrupted each attempt. The Luftwaffe pilots weren't retreating. They were skilled, persistent, and motivated. But they were also constrained by physics and risk calculation. Every pass that Howard contested was a pass that failed to reach the bombers. Every failed pass consumed fuel, damaged morale, and wasted time. The bomber gunners began coordinating with Howard. They held their fire when he maneuvered, giving him space to work. They called out incoming threats over the radio. They watched his vulnerable rear quarter and covered his blind spots. An unplanned, unspoken partnership emerged between one fighter and 30 bombers working together against an enemy that outnumbered them all. For 30 continuous minutes, Howard fought alone over Germany. He burned through his ammunition. He burned through his fuel. He took hits from small-caliber rounds that punched through his fuselage and missed critical systems by inches. His engine temperature climbed into the red zone. His hands ached from gripping the controls. His vision tunneled from adrenaline and oxygen deprivation at high altitude. But the bomber formation held together, and gradually the German fighters began to disengage. When Howard's fuel gauge dropped below minimum reserve, the Luftwaffe broke off completely. It wasn't a retreat in the traditional sense. It was tactical calculation. The bombers were approaching the target zone where Allied fighters would return for the withdrawal phase. The risk-reward mathematics had shifted unfavorably. The German fighters peeled away in pairs, diving toward lower altitude and disappearing into the cloud deck below. Howard watched them though but didn't pursue. He had no ammunition remaining, no fuel to spare, and barely enough airspeed to maintain controlled flight. He eased his Mustang out of the bomber formation. The lead B-17 wagged its wings in recognition and gratitude. Howard returned the gesture, rolled level, and began the long glide back toward England. His engine coughed twice from fuel starvation. He adjusted the fuel mixture, leaning it out as far as he dared, and coaxed another 10 minutes of power from a nearly empty tank. The English coast materialized through the haze. He crossed at 2,000 feet, too low for safety but too high to bail out. He landed at the first available airfield. The Mustang rolled to a stop and the engine died immediately. Howard sat motionless in the cockpit as ground crew ran toward the aircraft. They found bullet holes in the wings, tail, and fuselage. They found an engine that had been running on fumes and determination. They found a pilot who had flown deeper into enemy territory, stayed longer under fire, and engaged more enemy aircraft than any escort mission on record. But they didn't find a scratch on him. Howard climbed out, filed a brief combat report, and said very little. He mentioned the bombers, the German fighters, and the unconventional maneuver he'd employed. He didn't embellish or claim certainty about outcomes. He simply described what had occurred. The bomber crews told a very different story when they landed back at their bases in England. During intelligence debriefings, they recounted the mission in vivid detail. They described the lone Mustang that had stayed with them for half an hour against impossible odds. They described the pilot who had flown inside their formation, absorbed attacks meant for them, and transformed himself into a mobile barrier against an entire German fighter group. The gunners estimated Howard had engaged at least 14 separate enemy aircraft. Some thought the number was higher. All agreed on one crucial fact. Without that pilot, they would not have survived to reach England. Word spread rapidly through the 8th Air Force. Within days, the story reached headquarters. Commanders reviewed Howard's report, cross-referenced it with testimony from bomber crews, and analyzed the tactical implications of what had occurred. What Howard had done violated established protocol. By the book, it was reckless, but it had worked. And in a war where bomber losses were devastating morale and operational capacity, results mattered more than orthodoxy. In April 1944, James Howard was awarded the Medal of Honor. He became the only fighter pilot in the European theater to receive the nation's highest military decoration. The citation praised his courage, skill, and selfless devotion to protecting the bomber crews under his care. But the citation didn't mention the most important aspect of Howard's actions. He hadn't fought from blind heroism. He had fought from logic. He had identified a tactical problem, analyzed the variables in real time, and executed a solution that no manual had anticipated. He had turned himself into an effective weapon not through superior firepower but through positioning and geometry. He had understood that presence and disruption mattered more than kill counts. In doing so, Howard had exposed a critical vulnerability in German tactics that no one had successfully exploited before. The head-on attack had been the Luftwaffe's most devastating weapon against American daylight bombers. It relied on speed, shock, and the bombers' lack of adequate forward firepower. But it also relied on a psychological assumption. Escorts stayed outside the formation, protecting bombers from a distance rather than getting in the way. Howard proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. Within weeks of his mission, the 8th Air Force began training escort pilots in close-in defensive tactics. The goal wasn't to replicate Howard's lone stand, which was unsustainable and suicidal by design, but to incorporate elements of his positioning strategy into coordinated escort doctrine. Fighters began flying tighter to the bombers, positioning themselves along the most likely attack vectors. They stopped waiting for threats to develop and started preempting them. The mere presence of a fighter in the path of a head-on attack run forced German pilots to hesitate, adjust, or abort their approach. Loss rates began declining. The change wasn't immediate and wasn't attributable to a single factor. The introduction of long-range P-51 escorts in larger numbers, improved formation tactics, and attrition of experienced Luftwaffe pilots all played significant roles. But the shift in fighter positioning, the willingness to accept risk and get closer to the bombers, to disrupt rather than simply intercept, became a permanent feature of escort operations for the remainder of the war in Europe. Bomber crews noticed the difference immediately. They felt safer. They flew with greater confidence, and they spoke of Howard's mission as definitive proof that one pilot in the right place at the right time could alter the entire course of a battle. The Germans noticed as well. Intelligence reports from captured Luftwaffe pilots made reference to American fighters that refused to leave the bombers, that stayed close even under concentrated fire, and that made coordinated attacks significantly more difficult to execute. The tactic didn't stop German interceptions completely, but it reduced their effectiveness substantially. In a war of attrition, that reduction was sufficient. Howard returned to combat operations. He flew additional missions, helped train new pilots, and continued refining his tactical approach. He wasn't a natural self-promoter. He didn't give interviews or actively seek recognition. He simply flew, fought, and survived. By war's end, he had been credited with 6 aerial victories in the European theater, adding to his 6 kills with the Flying Tigers. His official tally was modest compared to some aces, but raw numbers failed to measure his true impact. He had demonstrated that courage without logic produced only noise, and logic without courage remained mere theory. Only together could they change outcomes. James Howard survived the war and remained in the Air Force, eventually rising to the rank of Brigadier General before retiring in 1966 after nearly 30 years of service. He lived quietly in Florida, far from public attention, and rarely spoke about the mission that had earned him the Medal of Honor. When occasionally asked about it in later years, he would say only that he did what the tactical situation required. He didn't characterize it as heroism. He called it problem-solving. He had seen bombers in danger, recognized a gap in the defenses, and filled it. The fact that it worked, he maintained, was as much fortune as skill. Those who flew with him disagreed with his modest assessment. They saw a man who had trained himself to think clearly under fire, to remain calm when chaos dominated, and to act decisively when others would have frozen. They saw someone who fundamentally understood that wars aren't won by blindly following rules but by knowing precisely when to break them. The specific maneuver Howard employed that day, flying inside the bomber formation to disrupt head-on attacks, was never officially codified in tactical manuals. It was too dangerous, too dependent on individual judgment, and too easy to misapply catastrophically. But the concept lived on in the oral tradition of fighter tactics. Instructors told the story to new pilots. Tactical officers debated its implications, and in the decades that followed, variations of the underlying principle appeared in air combat doctrine around the world. Howard's legacy wasn't a single tactic that could be taught by rote. It was a mindset, an approach to combat that understood air warfare was fundamentally about geometry, timing, and the willingness to occupy the space where the enemy least expected to find you. In the vast historical literature of World War II aviation, Howard's name appears less frequently than it deserves. He wasn't flashy or flamboyant. He didn't accumulate spectacular kill counts. He didn't fit the conventional archetype of the swaggering fighter ace. But the bomber crews who made it home on January 11, 1944 knew exactly what he had done, and they carried that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. Some named their sons after him. Some wrote letters of gratitude decades after the war ended. Some simply retold the story repeatedly to anyone who would listen. Because in a war that consumed millions of lives, James Howard reminded them that one individual and one critical moment could still tip the balance. Not through overwhelming firepower, not through blind luck, but through the rare combination of mental clarity, physical courage, and the absolute refusal to accept that the impossible was truly impossible. He died in 1995 at the age of 81. His funeral was attended by veterans, fellow pilots, and men who had flown in bombers over Germany half a century earlier. They didn't discuss tactics or doctrine. They spoke about the day a lone Mustang stayed when every logical calculation said to leave, and they spoke about the lesson he left behind, that the most powerful weapon in warfare isn't the machine but the mind that dares to use it differently.